Good morning, everyone. I'm Sandra Sugran, Director of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, or SELISIS. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's panel discussion on It's Not Just a Job, Disability, Equity, and Inclusion, and persons with disabilities in the workplace, which is hosted by the Disability Studies Research Cluster at SELISIS. Today, we come together to commemorate the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, December 3rd. A day dedicated to honoring the rights and dignities of persons with disabilities while also recognizing the ongoing challenges they face, particularly in the workplace. Despite significant progress, persons with disabilities continue to face workplace discrimination, and many are denied access to fair employment opportunities. The research conducted by our Disability Studies Research Cluster has shed light on the barriers caused by misunderstandings about disability and workplace accommodations. This year's theme for the International Day of Persons with Disabilities is Transformative Solution for Inclusive Development, the role of innovation in fueling an accessible and equitable world. This theme emphasizes the importance of innovation and new approaches to ensuring that persons with disabilities have equal opportunities to participate fully in society, particularly in the workplace. It is a reminder that inclusion requires ongoing innovation, both in policy and practice. Today's discussion is an important opportunity for all of us to engage with the vital topic of how we can better integrate persons with disabilities into the workforce. We will explore how workplace environments can be made more inclusive with a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Our esteemed panelists will also provide valuable insights into best practices for creating workspaces that embrace and support persons with disabilities. We are privileged to have a distinguished group of panelists with us today. They will share valuable insights on various aspects of disability inclusion in the workplace, including findings from an employer readiness survey addressing common misconceptions regarding the employment of persons with disabilities, and offering perspectives on workplace inclusion, particularly in the digital space. The panelists will also explore avenues for redress in cases of disability discrimination and highlight the intersection of good industrial relation practices with principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion, with a focus on disability inclusion. We are quite fortunate to have Dr. Bipaya Pari, chair of this panel, guiding our discussion today. Dr. Pari is a junior research fellow at SELISIS. Her research spans fields like education, well-being, employment, and social care, focusing on how social policies and public services can help achieve equality and social justice for persons with disabilities. Dr. Pari's work has been recognized not only for its practical impact, but also for its theoretical advancement. She possesses a strong foundation in both quantitative and qualitative research methods, which are essential to her contributions in promoting disability inclusion. As chair of the Disability Studies Research Cluster here at SELISIS, Dr. Pari has been instrumental in advancing this critical discourse. As we embark on this important conversation today, I encourage all of us to not only listen, but also reflect on how we can contribute to an inclusive, accessible, and supportive work environment for persons with disabilities. Let us use today's discussion as a catalyst for positive change. Thank you again for joining us, and I look forward to a productive and enlightening session. Dr. Pari, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Sukram, for the kind introduction. As I have the floor, I would like to say thank you to Dr. Sukram for her leadership and for the opportunity to facilitate today's panel discussion. And of course, thank you to all the panelists for agreeing to participate in today's event. So thank you all. So in terms of today's program, we are going into the presentations by the panel members, and each panelist will have about 10 minutes to present. I'm going to introduce all the panel members at once so that the presentations could flow into each other, and then that will flow into the question and answer segment at the end. And I'm going to present the panelists in the order in which they speak. So firstly, we have Ms. Qushiba La Fleur. Ms. La Fleur is the founder and CEO of We Care Deaf Support Network, a parent-centered organization in Trinidad and Tobago. Her work focuses on empowering parents of deaf and hard-of-hearing children while advocating for the broader deaf community. She collaborates with organizations and government agencies to promote inclusion, create employment opportunities, and ensure sustainable partnerships for people with disabilities. At Nestle, Ms. La Fleur serves as a sign language specialist and DEI, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion champion, actively contributing to the company's diversity and inclusion initiatives. Her experience includes leading sensitization workshops and advocating for disability inclusion in workplaces. As a dedicated parent to a deaf adult son, Ms. La Fleur continues to influence change in both professional and personal spheres, emphasizing employment, training, and development for the deaf and hard of hearing community. Welcome, Ms. La Fleur. Next, we have Mr. Kerwin Thomas. Mr. Kerwin Thomas is the president of the Trinidad and Tobago chapter of Disabled Peoples International. He is a community leader, youth advocate, and climate change advocate, primarily advocating for persons living with disabilities. He has represented Trinidad and Tobago at the recent SIDS conference in Antigua and Barbuda, where he spoke about the effects of climate change and disaster preparedness for persons living with disabilities in the region. Mr. Thomas was also invited to speak at the recent IOM conference on mitigation of climate change and climate justice in the region. As a young professional, he's making strides to lobby for the creation and implementation of legislation to promote an inclusive and an accessible society for all persons with disabilities. And of course, Mr. Thomas follows the motto, nothing about us without us. And that's why he's here on our panel today. So welcome as well, Mr. Thomas. Next, Ms. Tanisha Ash. Ms. Tanisha Ash is a labor market specialist in the Labor Market Information Unit of the Ministry of Labor, where she undertakes in-depth statistical and econometric analyses on a wide range of labor market issues. Her work focuses on critical areas such as labor migration, the formalization of the informal economy, the workforce development, and she also plays a key role in translating data insights into strategic policy recommendations aimed at improving labor market outcomes, in enhancing working conditions, and advancing the well-being of the population. Ms. Ash has been instrumental in several national initiatives, including the development of the National Skills Bank and the implementation of the job vacancy surveys in collaboration with stakeholders from the private sector and international organizations. Ms. Ash holds a bachelor's degree in economics and a master's degree in development statistics right here from the University of the West Indies. And she's also a PhD student in the social policy program right here at Salisis, where her research focuses on creating innovative policy frameworks. Her academic work is closely aligned with her professional expertise, driving the development of evidence-based policies that promote improved research for economic growth. We appreciate you being here, Ms. Ash. Welcome to the panel. Next, we have Ms. Lorelei Wong. She is an attorney at law with 8 years of experience specializing in civil litigation, human rights, and discrimination law. She holds a Bachelor of Laws with honors from the University of London, a legal practicing certificate from the University of Westminster, and a Master's of Laws from the Montfort University in Leicester. As a focal point for Disability Affairs and HIV/AIDS at the Equal Opportunity Commission, Ms. Young is a passionate advocate for the rights of persons with disabilities. She has played a key role in drafting the Commission's guidelines for employers on disability and represents the Commission at various multi-stakeholder consultations, championing the creation and implementation of disability-specific legislation. We're glad to have you here, Ms. Wong. Welcome. And then lastly, and of course not least, Mrs. Giselle Estrada. She has been an executive member of the board of the Employers Consultative Association since 2014 and has also served on several subcommittees such as accreditation as well as chair of the Industrial Relations Committee. She has a wealth of experience as a human resource and industrial relations professional, having served in both the public and private sector. Mrs. Estrada possesses more than 30 years of experience in different business operations, which include ArcelorMittal, Trinidad Cement Limited, as well as the public service. In addition, she has served for 11 plus years at as an employee and industrial relations manager at the Republic Bank Group, locally and regionally in the areas of human resource, employees relations, and industrial relations, as well as dispute resolution. Mrs. Estrada holds an MBA with a specialism in human resources from the Anglia Ruskin University. She's also certified in advanced mediation by the Stitfeld Handy Group, and she continues to hold various leadership positions, including serving as an alternate member of the Recognition, Registration, and Certification Board. As an industrial relations consultant, Mrs. Estrada adopts a pragmatic approach to employee relations, where she combines her mentoring style of knowledge and experience to suit the situation and objectives of the teams and individuals that she works with. So as you can tell, the panelists carry a wealth of information on employment and industrial relations and can speak to the idea that it is more than just a job when we are considering the inclusion of persons with disabilities in the workplace. And so just a gentle reminder to all the panelists that you have 10 minutes to present. And in wanting to keep with the time, I will give a signal when you just have about 2 minutes remaining. And that said, without further ado, I invite our first speaker to share their presentation. Ms. La Fleur.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me at this presentation. So I will talk about the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiative at Nestle and, some of the misconceptions that employers would have when it comes to hiring persons with disabilities. So at Nestle, DEI is very important for us. And in Nestle, diversity, we believe that it's more than just, it's more than just a diverse workforce. We believe in inclusivity, and we ensure that this is part of our Nestle culture. This will make the company a better company. Part of our DEI initiative, we had a woman, we started with women in leadership, and 42% of the overall workforce in Nestle are currently women. 62% of those women are in senior and executive positions, and 23% of those women are also within our factories, and this is within our region. And then we have, under our DEI initiative, people with disabilities. And there's a grand openness within the company to include persons with disabilities. In this particular initiative, we have deaf youths working within our company among the employee population. And we know that is a very important approach in learning and reconstructing mindset. So we focus on that type of progress. For us to ensure that we did what was required to be accessible and provide the resources required for deaf persons, Nestle did a couple of things at the beginning, and it's something that all employers should pay attention to. They did a safety and risk assessment to ensure that the company, the factory, and the different areas around were up to the code when it comes to disabilities. They partnered with other NGOs and organizations to assist in sensitizing the management and other junior staff in that instance to ensure that they were on board and understood the need to have this part of the diversity program accepted by all. They recruited a sign language specialist, which I am at the moment in Nestle, and we engage in a number of disability sensitizations with all the employees across board. So Nestle, within the company, we are within a region, and we have the different persons in the Caribbean islands as well. So they were all exposed to the sensitization and awareness. And we continue to develop that by providing sign language classes to the employers within Nestle to be able to communicate with the employees. So at present, we have 3 deaf and 1 hard of hearing employee, and 20% of our general population within the company of Nestle learned sign language level 1 and level 2. At present, our HR team, it's about 13 of us. They are also learning sign language. I'm spearheading the instructions so that they, as the HR team, would be able to effectively communicate with the deaf employees. And this is something, as we go into the misconceptions of employers, it's important for employers to do a couple of things at the beginning, because most employers believe that engaging support or providing accessibility or resources for persons with disabilities is very expensive. when this is not true. Most times this is a one-off expense, and then it will be something ongoing where it's all part of the culture of the company. In this instance, we had to do a safety and risk assessment, and 1 or 2 things needed to be implemented. That was implemented. We do not have to go back as a company to do that again. So the cost of that was a one-off cost. Because we're hiring deaf persons, you needed to have a sign language interpreter on board or sign language specialist, someone who can guide that process, but somebody who is also involved in sensitizing, awareness training, and who can help in the teaching process. And that's why I am here. I am part of the team along with a external deaf tutor who I've engaged to support me in teaching the sign language classes to ensure that everyone within the company was exposed. So it's important for employers to understand, as we say, it is not just a job as well. The deaf persons who we have working within Nestle, they feel a sense of pride and a sense of accomplishment because this is an international company. And it's like the first for many of them working in a factory setting or in an industrial setting. And we have deaf young persons, when they were employed based on their skills and their qualifications. And now they're placed in positions within the company that matches their skills and their qualifications. So we have deaf youths in our engineering department training there, deaf youths in our agri-services department, and deaf youths in the other areas within the factory. So for employers to get a better understanding of, the requirements and understanding that some of the things that we think are challenging are not as challenging, sensitization is key. Some people believe that, which is another misconception, that the HR team is the one who drives hiring and drives training. So they should be responsible for onboarding, and because everyone, they're open to DEI, we're going to hire some people with disabilities, but they do not engage or involve the top management. It's key for top management to be on board in decisions like these and to be involved in it as well. Get your top managers sensitized, get them aware, help them to understand the language that is used, but not also the language to be used, but also the benefits of having persons with disabilities working within your company as well. Because some people do not believe, I'm going to hire some people with disabilities. They are just going to put a strain on our internal population. And from the observations and working with Nestle, and if you hear some of our management or even the colleagues speak, you would understand that that is not the case. And for all of us who work with people with disabilities, we will know for a fact that persons with disabilities are very committed, they're dedicated, and they're loyal to their jobs. So once you give them the opportunity and employ them, they feel a sense of accomplishment and they feel a sense of belonging. Once you respect them and you show them that they are all part of the team, they are going to stay with your company or your organization for a very, very long time. So it's not like you will have that turnover of staff, every year or all the time. You would have those people with disabilities working with you for a very long time. So those things are very important for employers to understand when it comes to engaging persons with disabilities. And as the title or the theme of the webinar is, it's not just a job, like I said before, for persons with disabilities. This is a sense of accomplishment. Companies opening up their doors, persons opening up their organizations to engage persons with disabilities to be as part of their diverse workforce. That is very important under the DEI. And having persons with disabilities be a part of your team, it helps the other employees within your company also be open to understanding things that they were not aware of. So sensitizing and raising awareness is one, but in Nestle at the moment, our deaf persons are involved in almost anything and everything. During the week of the deaf in September this year, we also had a football tournament. And in that football tournament, our hearing team played the deaf team. And it was one of the most fascinating games to watch because the hearing guys were like doing the normal thing that people do when they're playing football and then realize we have to communicate differently. And at the end of the competition, the guys were fascinated by, you know what, we want them to play along with us. So now we're also incorporating the deaf persons within our hearing football team in Nestle. And that created a camaraderie and a bond among the footballers who work in the factory and the other parts of the company with the deaf employees and the deaf supporters who came in. So to close, what I would do is just show you a short video of one of our employees. Her name is Cheyenne. She's a deaf youth. And this was an initiative we had for International Women's Day. So to close, I'll have Cheyenne close off my presentation to show you the inclusiveness of Nestle, or the inclusivity, I should say. Hi, my name is Cheyenne, and I am deaf. I was given the opportunity to join Nestle in November of 2023 and became a part of the Nestle Empower Me program. It was my first time at a company like Nestle, and I was very excited. I spent some time learning about the different factory tasks, and in December, I began working in the factory supporting the production team. I was very happy that I was provided with the necessary support and resources needed to do my job. The team at Nestle has been very encouraging, making sure that we all feel valued and included in every aspect of our work. As a proud young deaf female who is also a youth champion in cycling in Trinidad and Tobago, being a part of the Nestle Empower Me program has made a positive impact on my life. I'm extremely grateful for this wonderful opportunity, especially as a young woman with disabilities. I want to say thanks to Nestle for believing in me and giving me the chance to prove myself. I'm also excited to grow and learn as we continue to break barriers and create a more inclusive workplace for all. So thank you guys very much. And as Cheyenne showed, this is the inclusivity at Nestle. And for those companies out there who are interested in hiring persons with disabilities, just keep in mind that it's not just a job, it's more than just that for them. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you, Ms. La Fleur, and thank you for introducing us to Cheyenne as well. Thank you for sharing about the DEI initiative at Nestle, and as well as speaking about one of the common misconceptions among employers, which is it's going to cost a lot to hire them. And I'll also speaking about the commitment of persons with disabilities, and in the long run, it's going to be more profitable to the employer if a person with disability is hired. So thank you again. And so we're going to move right along to Mr. Thomas, who is going to bring the perspective of a person with a disability. Mr. Thomas.
Hi, pleasant morning to the members of the panel and all the other persons online on the other online networks. I'd like to say special thanks to the UWI Disability Studies Research Cluster, Dr. Perry and the entire team, working hard to ensure that an event such as this is very, very important and critical so that we can be able to sensitize persons out there in terms of inclusivity and all the other issues that persons with disabilities face. To the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social Economic Studies, and also in commemoration of the United Nations International Day of Persons with Disabilities. And just to commemorate the theme of today's event, it's not just a job, disability, equity, and inclusion, and persons with disabilities in the workplace. And in keeping with this year's theme for the commemoration of International Day of Persons with Disabilities, it's amplifying the leadership of persons with disabilities for an inclusive and sustainable future. My name is Kerwin Thomas. I am the president of the Trinidad and Tobago chapter, Disabled Peoples International. And definitely it's a pleasure to be here today as a person who is a wheelchair user. In 2005, I was involving a robbery and also got gunshot wounds that left me in a paraplegic state. And at that time, I was working at the Peak Technologies as an air condition technician, which requires me to be climbing steps, going up tall steps, ladders, going up on buildings, etc. And after that, I wasn't retained as an employee, even in the office. But I think that even after moving away from being an air condition technician, I began just looking at other opportunities of the abilities that I still possess, one in which would have been the ability to speak. And that kind of drove me into a direction where I could have been able to go and do radio and just do other studies that will enable me to even move forward in a direction that caters to, creating an inclusive space for me as someone with a disability. I just want to give a quick scenario of a particular job that I applied for. I applied for a job at a popular radio station, after receiving my advanced certification in radio broadcasting. And I must say, coming out of a cadre of persons, over 100 and something applicants, I was shortlisted, just to cut a long story short, to the last 3 persons. And doing overnight radio shows, so that those persons could have been able to see the potential and the talent that I would have possessed. Even coming out of the last 3, they didn't select me. And the person who was the coordinator of the entire event, he even came after and said it wasn't a situation of your ability, but it was a situation of the employer not wanting to make reasonable accommodation to accommodate me at that particular institution. Moving along from there, because we know that we gathering those stones, we moving forward, we want to make a big impact. We want our voices to be heard. I would have applied to another radio station. And at that particular radio station, when I sent in my demo, I didn't identify that I was someone who uses a wheelchair, someone with a disability. And same thing, was shortlisted out of almost about 80 something applicants to the last 8. And at that particular institution, they didn't have the requirements in terms of an elevator, etc. But I myself knowing that, I came and I brought 2 other persons to actually hoist me up those steps. You're eager, you're hungry for this thing. And when I came upstairs with the other 7 applicants, the interviewer was like, "But you're on a wheelchair?" And I was like, "Yeah," but as it doesn't stop me from using my voice. I think that, the ability to use my voice is what this job is about. However, they didn't have the requisite elevators or any kind of access for me to get into the studio. And because of that, I was not selected. And that was just 2 instances in terms of me not, pushing forward to try to see how best I could have been able to get into the job market. And also my love for radio, etc., and presenting. And it didn't happen. But, we move forward with a positive mindset. I think that as we speak to empower persons living with disabilities in Trinidad and Tobago and the world over to become leaders and create the environment for inclusivity and sustainable future, we must pay close attention to the issues that we face in the workplace. And when I say issues that we face in the workplace, I would have worked at the Ministry of Works and Transport as a personal development officer for 9 years. I think that this year would have been one of the years that I would have moved on from being a personal development officer. And that particular job entails the assessment, interviews, assessment, and or trying to seek placements for persons, not just persons with disabilities, but persons to be enrolled into the job market based on their qualifications, their competencies, their skills, and their abilities. And I know one of the such programs where I would have lent to try to get some of the young people involved in was the on-the-job training, which was a great opportunity for young people to get the necessary skills and competencies. And even one person in particular with a disability, she was a wheelchair-bound person who would have gone on to actually acquiring a job at a secondary school, which was very, very, very encouraging to see that persons with disabilities were being included into the workforce, And one of the major challenges is the ableism. Ableism refers to the discrimination or social prejudice against persons living with disabilities, and it is rooted in the assumption or the belief that persons with disabilities are incapable or inferior to the non-disabled persons. And I mean, when we look at that particular phrase, the ableism, even in an interview session, let's say 10 persons come into an interview, and you are someone who is either blind, you're either deaf, or someone who uses a wheelchair, amongst 10 other persons who are not wheelchair users, who are able-bodied persons, definitely the interviewer might say, or they might think within their minds that I don't think this person might be skilled or even competent enough to carry out the duties as somebody who is non-disabled, you know. I think it's definitely this assumption really is something that we really need to put in the back burner and really understand that persons with disabilities, that we don't look at the disability, but we look at the ability of that person who can be able to be a meaningful contributor into any space or any sphere that they are given the opportunity to advance whatever knowledge and skills that they have. And while many other problems with disabilities are capable of making a meaningful contribution, as I said before, in the workplace, they are often face barriers due to the outdated assumptions, fear, and the stigma, and also the prejudices. The Trinidad and Tobago Equal Opportunities Act provide a statutory framework for the treatment of persons with disabilities in the workplace, and I know that we have somebody who will speak to some of those issues, so I wouldn't want to delve too much into that. And the Act defines a disability as a total or partial loss of the bodily functions, and some other information there that I think that person, that presenter will probably touch on. And the Act prohibits an employer from discriminating against a disabled employee. That is to say, treating that particular employee less than favorable than the non-disabled person when it comes to employment opportunities or even in the job space where persons with disabilities want to strive and thrive. All right, some of the ways that we can support persons with disabilities in the workplace. So one of the words that is used, and is used very broadly, is this reasonable accommodation. Reasonable accommodation in terms of employers should make adjustments to the physical workspace. All right, physical workspace in terms of making sure that the washrooms are accessible, make sure that we have rails, we have ramps, we have elevators, we have space for persons who are wheelchair bound. And I know that Qushiba would have made mention, Ms. La Fleur, sorry, would have made mention to having interpreters at the particular establishments. So persons who are deaf, they themselves can be able to feel included into the organization and be a part, contributing positively to the workforce. All right, making accessibility a priority to ensure that the workplace is accessible to people with disabilities, including physical disability, as well as accessibility of information and communication technologies. All right, we want to be able to match the qualified job seeker with suitable jobs and consider both the needs of the employer and the qualifications and interests of the disabled candidate. You know what I mean? It's not just we just want to hire somebody with a disability because it will look good, it will be a PR kind of arrangement, but definitely employers wanting to really create a level of inclusivity. And as we say, the equitable part where we can be able to have persons with disabilities can be able to sustain themselves. All right. To get the commitment from the top, a statement from the CEO can be a powerful making disability inclusivity, like a company policy, to remove recruitment barriers, analyze the recruitment processes to ensure that there are no barriers for persons with disabilities in terms of the recruitment and the hiring processes, to provide disability awareness training that helps employees to feel more confident about communicating with persons with disabilities. I think Ms. La Fleur would have made mention to Nestles, and I must thank Nestles and other institutions like Scotiabank and all these other institutions who are making a lot of strides to ensure that persons with disabilities are included into the workplace. All right, and just to wrap up, I would just like to say, in keeping with this year's theme of International Day of Persons with Disabilities, employers believe that leadership truly owns the effort and to build more inclusive workspace, and they are likely to have more respect towards those persons who may become leaders, and to show loyalty to the organization. Let's continue to be pioneers and advocates for persons living with disabilities in Trinidad and Tobago and the region to promote an inclusive society and where leadership for persons with disabilities for inclusion and sustainable future is paramount. I thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Thomas. So you touched on a lot of interesting points. I like the idea, well, the fact that you brought up the idea of disability disclosure as well as accommodations, and then touched on the point of ableism, which is coming through in the discussion in the chat. So I'm hoping we'll get to that a little more in the question and answer segment. And then your conversation, your presentation sparked the point about self-advocacy also in the chat. And so looking to see more about that in the question and answer segment. But thank you, Mr. Thomas, for your presentation. And so going straight into the presentation by Ms. Ash, you're invited to present now. Thank you.
Right, thank you. So, thank you for allowing me to be part of this initiative. My name is Tanisha Ash from the Ministry of Labour, and I'll be presenting on the Employment Readiness Survey, perceptions of on-the-job training providers on the employment of persons with disabilities. Now, before I go into the survey, into the presentation, I would like to present a little outline of the presentation. First, I will start with an overview of background, the reason behind the presentation, the objectives, methodology, background of the respondents, results or main findings, and then go straight into the conclusions. Now, the on-the-job training division within the Ministry of Labour observed limited placements of persons with disabilities, and with no formal exploration of the underlying reasons behind these challenges, we decided to conduct this survey. Given the Ministry of Labour's mandate for decent work and equal opportunity for all, and the on-the-job training division's mission to enhance work readiness for nationals between the ages of 16 to 35, it was necessary to investigate these placement barriers. The goal is to create effective solutions to increase placement opportunities. Now, the overarching objective of the survey is to identify and address the obstacles in placing persons with disabilities in the on-job program, to gather information and to develop effective strategies that can bridge the gap with for the persons with disabilities in the workplace and readiness and acceptance. The immediate objectives is understanding employers' perspectives, identifying barriers, assessing opportunities, as well as informing strategic interventions. Now, the method used to collect the responses was a survey method. The survey was conducted during the period January to June of this year using a mixed method approach where there were both open and closed-ended responses. The target population was on-the-job training providers using the on-the-job training data set. Sample size was calculated using the quotient formula and yielded an estimated sample of 296 persons. We oversampled to 500 providers to account for possible non-responses and stratified random sampling approach stratified by region as well as industry. The survey was distributed via email with follow-up phone calls to improve responses, and the results yielded a 24% response rate out of the 500 expected responses. That is 120 out of 500. We also employed a weighted methodology to account for any sampling biases, such as oversampling in some areas and undersampling in other areas, as well as possible non-responses. And the statistical package for social science software was used to analyze the quantitative responses, and principles of content analysis were applied for the qualitative aspect. Now, the majority of respondents held senior positions. So these persons represented their organizations in determining the willingness or readiness to accommodate persons with disabilities. Some other positions mentioned were the human resource officers, counselors, and others. It is also important to note that the majority of organizations within the data set were small to medium-sized organizations. The trend is consistent across the different regions. For example, all organization in Central was small. In Eastern region, 32% of the organization small. In Tobago, 80% of the organizations were 90%, 99 or fewer. In Western region, mixed distribution, with 29% classified as small and 18% having over 1,000 employees. There was also a public sector dominance within the data set. This distribution was across all regions as well, where 73% of organizations in the East were public, 68% in the South were public, and so on. All the organizations in the Central fell under other category, where it was neither public nor private. And the data set was also largely comprised of the education industry, where schools where OJTs have been placed. Other industries were admin and support services and human health or social work, public admin, and so on. But they fell within the lower spectrum. Now on to the main findings. First, we asked the employers' attitudes and perceptions. A noteworthy 42% of organizations currently provide employment opportunity for persons with disabilities. This highlights that over half of the organization remained hesitant to engage in these initiatives. Other significant findings were the 31% of organizations that offer internship opportunities, 44% provide workplace accommodations, 17% implement specific recruitment processes, and 30% introduce measures to prevent or mitigate discrimination. And these statistics indicate a positive signal. In some areas, though, there is considerable room for improvement in fostering inclusive employment practices. And to gain clearer understanding of the stakeholders' perceptions, it was essential to evaluate the level of preparedness among organizations. The level of preparedness is defined as an organization's readiness and commitment to employ persons with disabilities. This is determined through an assessment of the 5 critical areas as mentioned in the slide above: provision of employment opportunities, the availability of training programs, workplace accommodations, special arrangements within the hiring process, as well as anti-discrimination measures. Organizations are rated on a scale of unprepared where no measures were in place to extremely prepared where all measures were available. According to the findings, 40% of the organizations were categorized as unprepared. However, the remaining 60% demonstrated some degree of preparedness by meeting one or more of the assessed dimensions. To gain a better understanding of stakeholders' interpretations of their willingness to accommodate persons with disabilities, a classic self-evaluation approach was utilized. The results reveal that 91% of employers expressed a willingness to accommodate persons with disabilities. Of these, 77% were willing but not prepared, and the remaining 14% were both willing and prepared. Conversely, 9% of training providers indicated they were neither willing nor prepared to accommodate persons with disabilities, highlighting a significant gap in acceptance and readiness within this group. Onto the barriers in workplaces. Now, when asked about the presence of barriers within their organizations, 36% of organizations acknowledge the existence of such barriers. Among the 36%, cost of infrastructural accommodations emerged as the most significant challenge. But how do these barriers vary across the different types of disabilities? To accurately evaluate the barriers, it was crucial to first identify whether these organizations had employees with disabilities. This foundational information is essential for conducting a thorough and informed assessment of the challenges faced within such workplaces. Of the 22% of organizations that currently have staff with disabilities, physical and sensory disabilities were the most common form of disabilities within these organizations. Among these organizations that employ staff with disabilities, those with employees that have physical and sensory disabilities reported encountering specific barriers. Other forms of disabilities, the organizations did not encounter any barrier. As depicted in the graph, physical disabilities were predominantly associated with cost of infrastructure, while sensory linked to cost of training. Opportunities for inclusive practices. Now, training providers also implemented various inclusive practices, including work-based accommodations. As mentioned, as shown in the graph, wheelchair access, EAP services, as well as job recruitment. Those 65% lack these measures. Strategic impact. Among the 65% of training providers that do not currently provide these accommodations, a significant portions have no plan of implementing such measures. The reason behind no plan of implementing these measures were the absence of staff, infrastructural limitations, and the non-compliance current physical infrastructure. Organizations also reported implementing various measures to accommodate persons with disabilities, as well as strategies for promoting disabilities awareness and education. Now, the ministry also sought to identify strategies to facilitate the hiring of persons with disabilities. The most notable approach chosen by the majority of organizations was conducting sensitization sessions to address the challenges faced by staff with disabilities. Additional support needed were new school infrastructure for the on-the-job training providers that are schools, as well as additional modifications of existing buildings. Now, in conclusion, today's findings highlight both the challenges and opportunities in fostering inclusive workplace for persons with disabilities. While many organizations have demonstrated a willingness to accommodate, there is still significant work to be done in terms of preparedness and addressing barriers such as infrastructure and training costs. The Ministry of Labour remains committed to promoting decent work, industrial peace, and opportunities for all, ensuring that no one is left behind. The Ministry of Labour continues to pursue action through the internal committee promoting inclusion of persons with disabilities and regular dialogue with the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services, as well as organizations for persons with disabilities, such as Trinidad and Tobago's Blind Welfare Association. By continuing to engage stakeholders, facilitating targeted interventions like sensitization sessions, and drive inclusive policy, we can create a labor market that truly reflects the values of equity and opportunity. Let us move forward together, building workplaces that empower and include all individuals, regardless of ability. Thank you. That is the end of my presentation.
All right, great. Thank you, Ms. Ash. I think some results really hinting at a positive signal regarding employers' readiness and willingness when it comes to the employment of persons with disabilities in Trinidad and Tobago. Of course, something that Ms. La Fleur also highlighted, the cost of accommodations being a barrier or a hindrance. So again, something perhaps we can pick up more on in the question and answer segment. I'm just going to allow Ms. Lorelei Wong to give her presentation now. Ms. Wong?
Hi, morning, everyone. Let me just share my slides. Okay, great. So good morning to all panelists and all attendees today. Sincerely, firstly, I would like to thank Dr. Parry, whose dedication and effort to make this session possible for today. Dr. Parry has been very instrumental in fostering the collaboration between the Equal Opportunity Commission and the university. And of course, it advances the discourse on disability within Trinidad and Tobago. So my topic for today is basically the Equal Opportunity Commission as an avenue for redress for persons with disabilities and for disability discrimination and providing reasonable accommodation for persons with disabilities. So as I go ahead into my presentation, we're going to look at what disability means. And Mr. Thomas would have kind of spoken to what the definition is currently under the Equal Opportunity Act, which has been proposed amendment for change to the Attorney General. But right now, as the definition stands for disability, as we can see, it's encompassing of many different types of disabilities, as well as it makes room for chronic illnesses as well. So it's a total or partial loss of a bodily function, part of the body, it's a malfunction. So we might also see the definition to be a somewhat archaic, the terminology being used. However, despite the terminology as it exists currently, we have made proposed amendments to the AG to change the definition as well as to include chronic illnesses. When we speak about disability in Trinidad and Tobago, apart from the Equal Opportunity Commission, as there's currently no disability-specific legislation, however, there's a draft Persons with Disabilities Bill that is currently out for comments from various stakeholders. We have a duty under the Equal Opportunity Act, as well as under Article 27 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Trinidad and Tobago has signed the United Nations Convention in 2007, and we later ratified it into the domestic law in June 2015. So when we talk about discrimination based on one's disability, and in particularly when we look at the employment aspect of it, we would see here it prohibits discrimination based on disability regarding matters concerning all forms of employment. And when we say all conditions of employment, we are talking from the initial process of recruitment, which means the hiring, from the time in which the advertisement goes out. And then we talk about during the course of employment, so while you are employed, continuance of employment, career advancement, and a safe and healthy working environment. We also speak to the protection of rights of persons with disabilities to allow these persons to be on an equal basis with others, to have just and favorable conditions of work, including equal opportunities and equal remuneration for work of equal value, and to also ensure where employers have a right to make sure that they have a duty to provide the worker, whether it's a regular worker as well as a worker with a disability, to a safe and a healthy working conditions and a safe system of work, including protection from harassment, and offer them a redress for their grievances. When we look at, in my session today, I'm going to look at reasonable accommodations. And again, Mr. Thomas would have touched on some. Reasonable accommodations is defined in the UN Convention as necessary and appropriate modification and adjustments, not imposing a disproportionate or undue burden, where needed in a particular case to ensure persons with disabilities have the enjoyment or exercise on an equal basis with others of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. So what I'm going to do is basically break down what you see is emboldened there. When we talk about necessary, we look at necessity. Reasonable accommodation essentially is not about fulfilling personal preferences or whims of people with disabilities. What it actually speaks to, it's providing what is required to ensure that these persons with disabilities can join in on an equal basis with others. So let's just say, for example, a person who may have diabetes, their request for accommodation may come in the form of providing sugar-free meals at a meeting, for example. And it is not, I would say this, it's not for an employer at this meeting to provide this individual with lobster, steak, smoked salmon, because it is their choice of favorite food. What it basically means is that this person has indicated that they have a dietary restriction due to their illness, diabetes, and as such, they are requiring a sugar-free meal. So that is an example of what is necessary. When we move forward and we're looking at appropriateness, so we look at appropriate, we talk about not merely making changes for their own sake, but it's about doing, again, what is needed to ensure that the persons with disabilities can participate equally. They want to feel that sense of belonging. So it has to be, the request is something that is appropriate. So let's just say, for instance, constructing a ramp to enable a disabled worker to access, let's just say, a washroom or a cafeteria in the workplace. Whereas inputting new windows may not be what the accommodation is. They would need that particular ramp, or let's just say, that's if they have a physical disability. Putting on a window is not important for their disability. It's accessibility to access their benefit, so the cafeteria, whatever it may be. Then we move on to modification and adjustments. When we speak about reasonable accommodation, it's about tweaking what currently exists. And I know there may be a little bit of controversy behind that, tweaking what already exists. Because, for example, we always advocate for inclusion rather than integration. Integration means we have this system already created, and then we try to integrate persons with disabilities into that, what already exists. They were not first taught, they were not taught about when the system was created. When we talk about inclusion, we actually have those conversations with persons with disabilities before creating something that is particular to their individual needs. So, however, in the interim, and we know sometimes when we try to make these amendments, it may take a long period of time. So the interim, there are certain things that can be done with respect to reasonable accommodation to tweak what already exists. So let's just say an organization has their premises or services and programs that their activities are equally accessible to persons with disabilities. It may not be necessary to provide any further extra reasonable accommodations per se, right? Because it's undoubtedly the best option and can result from disability mainstreaming. When we look at one of the bigger areas, when we look at cases that come to the Equal Opportunity Commission per se, we discuss what is disproportionate or undue burden, because it's also one of the exemptions that exist. And I'm just going to scroll down to what is undue hardship here. When we look at one of the things surrounding reasonable accommodation, we automatically bring up that issue of undue financial burden or financial hardship. So no person or entity has to provide reasonable accommodations that are unduly extensive and disruptive and can cause some sort of financial difficulty to the operations of that individual's business. So we say here, it's defined as an action requiring significant difficulty or expenses. We look at the cost of the accommodation that is required. Remember, at the end of it, we talk about accommodation, but we have to also specify and look at it has to be reasonable. We look at the size of the organization, what the economic resources of the employer is, and the degree of impact the accommodation would have on the organization's operations, right? So while the above statement is echoed, right, in the Equal Opportunity Act, there should be a balance between the accommodations required by the employee versus the capacity, and when I say capacity, the financial capacity of the employer. So it's very important to know that when a case like this comes to the Equal Opportunity Commission, where reasonable accommodation had not been provided, it is reviewed on a case-by-case basis, because sometimes we need to know what is the financial constraints that the employer has. So it's very important that persons are aware when lodging a complaint with the Equal Opportunity Commission. These are some of the concerns these are some of the issues that we may need addressed from both the employer and employee as well. So reasonable accommodation, when we talk about requesting reasonable accommodation from an individual, this can happen from at the time of the interview in the recruitment process all the way until you are actually employed with the organization. And you make this request as soon as you're aware that there are hindrances in the workplace, for example, or that type of job that may inhibit you from applying or carrying out roles and functions of the job, or equally accessing, such as promotions and training opportunities associated, so any benefits associated to the job. The onus is on the employee to apprise the employer of the accommodation that they need. It is not for the employer to envisage that particular request for accommodation, because it takes away, and that particular need for the onus to be on the employee takes away the need from biased assumptions of an employer. Generally, when requesting accommodation, at the Equal Opportunity Commission, we tend to let persons know that you put it in writing, because again, in the event that your request for reasonable accommodation is denied and it potentially leads you to I'd say litigation proceedings or investigative process, such as the Equal Opportunity Commission does, we tell you to put your name, the position that you hold, the date on which your request is being made, because it will look at the time period in which it's granted or not granted, information relating to your disability. So you explain what your disability is, the nature and severity of that disability, and you need to put in a specific statement that you are requesting reasonable accommodation. You know your disability best. No one knows it as well as you. Now, somebody else may have a similar disability to you or the same disability, but the experience is very different. So therefore, you would know what you need, and that is exactly what you should request. We also let persons know, document everything. And again, the onus is on you. So follow up on all applications and maintain an active discourse. Once it is that the employer receives that request from you, they should just confirm in writing that they have received the request from you. They also have to let you know that it may possibly be beneficial, again, for litigation proceedings. There's a paper trail that you submit your request in writing and submit it to human resources. Again, the engagement in discourse between you and the employer is very important because they want to be apprised of what your disability is to see how well they can accommodate you. The employer may request that you furnish a medical note or medical certificate from a doctor detailing the specificity of that disability and any recommendations that they may deem fit. You know, sometimes we get a medical certificate, you may have a permanent partial disability, and the recommendation might be, you know, to work on lighter duties, desk work. As Mr. Thomas would have indicated, he went from sort of operational kind of job doing his AC work, and then a request would have been to probably have him behind desk work, something to afford reasonable accommodation as well. So while the employee is entitled to that reasonable accommodation and the employer has a duty to provide them with some form of reasonable accommodation, they may not always get what is requested. And that is because we have to ascertain whether or not the employer is in a financial position to provide that accommodation. But effective accommodation is what is also very much necessary as well.
Okay, Ms.
When
Wong,
we talk,
wrap up, please.
sure, no problem.
Thank you.
Okay, no problem. So we just basically say that there are the exemptions. It is the, I would say it is the undue financial hardship. An employer owes a duty of care to provide the individuals with reasonable accommodation. Put your request in writing just for the purpose of litigation proceedings. That's it for my session, and any questions we'll take after. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Wong. Sorry to, stop your presentation, because everything you were saying was very important. I think citizens would have wanted to hear more, but just for us to get on with today's proceedings. Thank you very much for your presentation and speaking about the issue of undue hardship. I think this lends to the point that was brought up by Ms. La Fleur as well as Ms. Ash in terms of the cost of accommodations. So yeah, again, noting it as a point to probably touch on in the question and answer segment. And so moving on to our last presentation, Ms. Giselle Estrada, you have the floor now.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. And on behalf of the board of the ECA, let me thank you all for having us take part in this very important session today. As HR and IR professionals, we are the drivers of change within the organization. So today, as we gather to discuss diversity, equity, and inclusion with a focus on persons with disabilities, we clearly are going to reflect on the diversity of the modern workforce. And in doing that, we will want to recognize and acknowledge, and properly utilizing all of those things that can accommodate diversity, which is not a moral imperative, but a very strategic advantage for organizational success. So we would have been exposed to by the Ministry of Labor, thankfully, for some of these statistics locally, and we see that there's a lot of work to be done. And having said that, I would want to go into the presentation. There's speak a little bit about the diversity of modern workplaces, the importance of diversity management, what exactly is good industrial relations, the alignment between DEI and industrial relations, managing disability in the workplace, and some tips for creating a robust framework for DEI. So when we look at the overview of the framework for industrial relations in Trinidad and Tobago, we have a listing that I've put up here that covers a wide range of important pieces of legislation. And of course, for purposes of today, one of the critical pieces, and I've highlighted them, would be the Equal Opportunities Act, and of course, those conventions of the ILO in the quest for getting to that goal of decent work, and of course, addressing all those different things at the workplace that can prevent persons from getting the social justice that is required. Key to any workplace would be the HR or the industrial relations strategy. Some people tend to look at this as different entities. We at the ECA view it as one is a subset of the other, meaning every single aspect of HR has an IR component. And if it is that things are not done well, you will find yourself with not only challenges by the employees, but also the employer representatives. Because at the end of the day, the key critical part of the Industrial Relations Act talks about Section 10.3, which is fairness and equity. So throughout the presentation, there would be an emphasis on those two keywords as it relates to treating with employees at the workplace, especially those with disabilities. So when we look at diversity at the workplace, really a simple definition, not wanting in any way to take away from the EOC's definition of what a disability is, but really it speaks to, there's some element of similarities, but more differences with regard to different races, different cultures, different education, different backgrounds, different ethnicity, genders, age. People have different perspectives, different religions. So how do we manage all of these different perspectives? So in doing that and in helping, what professionals can do is adopt what is called diversity management. And this is a spread where you can have a strategy at the workplace, and this can prevent persons from challenging issues if it is that they feel that they are not being treated a particular way. For example, to bulletproof some of your policies, such as your recruitment policies, where you have physical and digital access, just as an example, for those persons with disabilities, so that they feel, as the young lady from Nestle spoke about, that sense of belonging. You also minimize exclusion. You reduce whatever mobility challenges. So let's say someone has to go to and fro to work in a wheelchair. If it is that he or she now has the access of remote work, it makes it a lot easier. So that promotes diversity and inclusion. Just to give an example, of course, some of you all spoke about some of the policies like promotion and training, the opportunities. Once you expose persons, it means that they have an equal opportunity, just like everyone else, to progress in the organization. But I guess the biggest challenge would be to actually get into the organization, as Mr. Kerwin Thomas shared with us in terms of his personal challenges, and of course, the data from the Ministry of Labor that really endorses the fact that we really are not there as yet. When we speak about the intersection with DEI and industrial relations, it means that the very set policies and the way we operate at the workplace, we can find ourselves having to face equal opportunities in terms of fines. People will take up issues and file grievances. They can go also to the industrial court. They can file matters at the High Court as well. If it is that we do not provide a safe workplace, and safe here is not just physical safety, we're talking about psychological safety as well, where you have a situation where, let's say, persons are subject to harassment, persons with disabilities, that at the end of the day, it means that they are not being exposed to a safe environment. Employers can be sued for not providing a safe workplace for their employees at the end of the day. These are basic tenets that are required. In terms of your disciplinary policies, it should be the same if it is that you have to discipline and someone with a disability as opposed to someone without a disability. Ideally, if we're speaking about discipline, it should follow the tenets of progressive discipline. As well as benefits owing to that person, you don't want to deny someone benefits as a consequence of him or her being with a disability. If it is that person's, let's say, performance appraisals, you get a certain rating and you're viewed for merit payment, it mustn't mean that the thinking is to withhold that benefit or that merit payment from the employee as a consequence of that disability. So at the end of the day, how we meet and treat with persons with disabilities, you can find yourself having to answer some hard questions at that lovely place on 7 St. Vincent Street, Port of Spain, and the whole of Justice. When we speak about good industrial relations, this is some of the things that we look for when we talk about good industrial relations. It really speaks about that relationship that you manage between the employees and management, and of course, the representatives of those employees, such as the trade unions. It's always a good idea to have procedures, rules, and regulations so that you set a standard in the organization. Of course, you have to comply with what is called natural justice, means that you treat everyone fairly. A man is innocent until proven guilty, regardless of whether he has a disability or not. That's just an example of natural justice. Of course, you operate within the established suite of labor legislation, the Industrial Relations Act, the Employee Opportunities Act, Workmen's Compensation, and the OSH Act, just to name a few. Ideally, if you have a unionized environment and you are about to negotiate collective agreements, it would be very progressive to include articles that have, let's say, HIV policy. And I can go a step further and speak to, I know that some insurance policies, the group health plans are now covering claims with regard to persons living with HIV and AIDS. So at the end of the day, this is also an opportunity to continue and to establish good employment practices, good industrial relations practices. Again, I have highlighted fairness and equity because your policies at the workplace really should speak to having those things in place, built in, and not reactive. So once it's proactive, it always places the employer in a better position. You should ideally have regular consultation with staff and their representatives for persons in the workplace, persons who may have come in with a disability and or may have suffered as a consequence of an accident, workplace incident as well, and now facing a disability, because in accordance with the Equal Opportunities guidelines for employers, they spoke about persons with disabilities. At some point, we all may suffer disability, albeit temporary, while at the workplace. In and out, I should say, at the workplace, but for purposes of today's discussion, we'll stick to the workplace.
Mrs.
So at some point, you may
asking you to wrap
suffer
up, please.
temporary
Mrs.
disability.
Estrada, asking you to wrap up, please.
Certainly. So just to some of the tips, of course, we can prioritize equal opportunities, collaborate with the ECA, embrace the guidelines of the ILO and the EOC, invest in specific training that covers emotional intelligence, and of course, sensitize your leadership team, just to highlight a few. And let me thank you all, and by extension, Yui, Dr. Parry, and the team for having the ECA today.
Great, thank you, Ms. Estrada. Of course, I know there is a lot more that you could have shared, and I'm hoping that you have the opportunity to do so in the question and answer segment. Thank you for sharing about industrial practices. I like the idea that an HR strategy overlaps with an IR strategy. It's the first time I heard that, so I appreciate that bit of new knowledge today. And I like the idea that you brought up remote work. I mean, remote work is something persons with disabilities have been asking for even before the pandemic. And I think only because of the pandemic that I think employers understand that remote work could work for persons with disabilities or persons in general, right? So thank you for bringing up the idea of remote work. Again, hoping to touch on this in the question and answer segment. So I just want to say thank you again to all the presenters. Thank you for all the information that you've shared with us, and it has prompted some discussion in the chat as well as some questions. So I'm going to go straight into the question and questions that were posed by some of the audience members, right? And they're pinpointed to certain persons for now. So I'm just going to start with Ms. Wong. There are two questions with regards to your presentation. How long does redress take at the EOC after lodging a complaint? So that's one question. And then the second question, does the EOC governance include assessment by a qualified occupational therapist?
All right, so to answer the first question about the time, because it's an investigative body, I think we operate on a case-by-case basis. And how it functions is that once a complaint is made and you satisfy the minimum requirements, it is for us to now send a notice to the respondent, the person you are complaining against. And because it's an investigation, sometimes when we receive a response, you view that response, you provide your feedback to us, we may think it's necessary to actually go back and write to the employer again, or the respondent again. So it's not to say it's defined or it's limited to 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. Sometimes matters can go on for years, depending on the type of information, the volume of information received, and the continuous investigative probing into the matter. So it's not to say I can give you, sometimes it can be 6 months and it could be a year. And then determinant on whether or not the matter goes further to conciliation, that's another step in the process at the Equal Opportunity Commission. It can take a longer time as well. But every case that comes to the Commission operates on a case-by-case basis because every individual's complaint is different from another. So with respect to the second question, I think someone had asked about including assessment by a qualified occupational therapist. When you lodge a complaint on disability discrimination, and I had spoken about the medical note from a doctor, yes, any information regarding your disability, the severity of the disability and the nature of your disability, we can get an assessment from a qualified occupational therapist because they are the persons who are probably have the best knowledge on that particular person's disability. But that doesn't go to say that we can't consult the medical doctor. If it's a company and the company has referred that particular employee to their company's doctor, we can also get an assessment from them. But yes, it's not limited to just a medical doctor external to the organization. So hopefully that answers your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Wong. And if it didn't, I believe it was Rachel who's asking the question. Of course, feel free to pose another question and we'll seek further clarification. So we have another question here. I think it came off the presentation by Ms. Ash. So I'm just going to ask it and throw it out to Ms. Ash, but if there are other panelist members who'd like to respond to the question, they're free to do so. So the question is, how can employers assess their readiness to hire and support persons with disabilities? Are there any tools or resources that can help in this evaluation? Ms. Ash?
Yes. No, there are currently no tools that can be used, but we can use a self-assessment approach to assess the readiness. As mentioned in the presentation, we used for the preparedness level, we assessed them by the provision of employment opportunities, workplace accommodations, anti-discrimination measures, as well as training opportunities to assess the preparedness, and readiness is a self-assessment approach we utilize to assess the readiness. However, there are no current tools available at the moment if someone else wants to pick up on that.
Yes, that's a good point. That's probably something that needs to be
Yes.
addressed. But I just want to throw the question to Ms. Wong, because I know the EOC has guidelines for employers on disability, and wondering if there is a tool in that document.
So the guidelines are very clear on what can be done. I guess depending on the type of disability as well. You can also look at the Bureau of Standards. They are a bit, it's so like, let's just say it's provision of goods and services or accommodation. Different bodies within Trinidad and Tobago, town and country, they may have their own standards that they may have to assess by. But we do have in our guidelines some recommendations as well. I don't think there's a particular tool that we have utilized, but again, it's on a case-by-case basis. And I think the best discourse on what tools can be used to determine what the company needs would obviously be that interaction between the employee with the disability and the employer at this point in time.
All right, great. Thank you for sharing, Ms. Wong. And as you were sharing, there was an assessment tool that was actually pasted in the chat, a link to an assessment tool. So I think that would be useful to everyone here and in the audience as well. I'm just going to ask if there's anybody else in the on the panel who wants to contribute to that question as well in terms of the tools, readiness assessment tools. No, all right. And so going on to the next question, and I believe this came off Ms. Wong's presentation. What about confidentiality in terms of HIV positive people? Some HR personnel are the cause of sensitive information leak. A very important issue being raised by an audience member. Can you speak to that a bit in terms of confidentiality when it comes to HIV positive status?
Sure. So I mean, when it regards health status, so HIV, whether you have AIDS or you're HIV positive, although it's not fully proclaimed as yet, I'm not sure. Employers should be guided by the provisions of the Data Protection Act in Trinidad and Tobago, because they should know that concerning an employee's physical and mental health condition is deemed to be considered as sensitive personal information under Section 2 of that act. So therefore, that particular information about your health status or your AIDS status is deemed sensitive. It should be kept private and personal and can only be processed by healthcare professionals or for specific purposes, such as research and statistics. If it is that you make your HIV status known to your employer of your own free will, it is depending on what they are going to do with that information. Is it that you are giving them that information on your status to request some type of reasonable accommodation? Lo and behold, if that's what you do, that information ought to be kept private and confidential, and not, sometimes in organizations we tend to say, this is just one's health status or AIDS status. Again, that can be a breach of the Data Protection Act as well. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. And I also want to throw the question to Ms. Estrada, because Mrs. Estrada would have spoken to Human Resources Industrial Relations. So I'm just wondering if the HR personnel leaking this sensitive information is violation of good industrial practices. If you can speak more about that and how it's dealt with if it does happen.
Yeah, it is definitely a breach of the person's privacy at the end of the day, and like any other medical information surrounding an employee, it has to be kept, sacrosanct. That shouldn't be shared under any circumstances, and if, according to Ms. Wong, it was shared because of a particular request in terms of accommodation, that's fine. And even so, that too has to be protected by all means at the end of the day, because as HR professionals, you're sworn to secrecy, so to speak. And, we make a joke of it and we say you mustn't even talk in your sleep about anything, because at the end of the day, that's really your lifeline. That is shared with you. You can't share anything at all.
Yeah. Can you just repeat the last point, Ms. Estrada? You muted yourself while you were speaking.
Yes, sorry. I said you can't share anything at all in terms of employee information.
All right, great. Thank you for answering. So this next question is actually for all the panelists, so feel free to jump in. So what are some strategies the panelists recommend in terms of improving accessibility, particularly when it comes to hiring practices, and onboarding practices. So this is open to everyone. So feel free to share in any order. Ms. La Fleur, do you want to go first? Strategies for improving accessibility.
Let me think. Yeah, let me think.
So anyone else wants to take that question? Strategies for improving accessibility?
I think
Ms.
one of the things that employers can do, in terms of the survey that was done by the Ministry of Labor as well, in terms of doing an assessment for the premises, because you have to match the jobs with the skill set. So in terms of making the accommodation, there could be a blended approach. So you may be able to extend that hiring process and it wouldn't cost you anything in terms of making an accommodation. Save and except, let's say you have monthly meetings and you really need to have, that ramp installed or a specific elevator installed. And sometimes you also need to assign what is called a buddy. So these things really don't cost too much money at the end of the day. So I think it's about raising the level of awareness, and educating persons about what options are open to them, depending on the design of the business, what the business is about, and what can be done.
All right, great. Thank you, Ms. Estrada. Does anyone else want to share?
Definitely, Dr. Perry, in terms of creating a culture where employees feel safe to disclose their disability, hiring more persons with disability, especially for leadership positions, not just the mundane positions, but in terms of leadership positions, and equipping managers with the tools and the resources to support individuals with their needs, all right? And creating an employee resource group, different strategies for employees with disabilities, prioritizing accommodation and accessibility at the workplace, and being an advocate and an ally for the community of persons with disabilities as well.
All right, great. Thank you for sharing those strategies. I just want to reiterate the point of disability disclosure. Ms. Wong would have spoken about the work between the UE and the EOC. And so one of the things that came out of an analysis of the complaints lodged by persons with disabilities with the Equal Opportunity Commission would have been that issue of disability disclosure. There are no guidelines for it currently, so it's something that needs to be worked on in the context of Trinidad and Tobago. But that's a question. When does someone disclose? Sometimes it's safe to disclose at the beginning of the process, but sometimes it is not safe to disclose at all. So it's something that we do need to consider. And as Mr. Kerwin said, we do need more advocates and allies in this space so that it makes disclosure easier. Moving on with the questions, I just want to pause and ask if there's anybody who wants to add to that discussion. Ms. La Fleur, I'm seeing your microphone unmuted. No.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know it was unmuted, but no, it's just, I think Ms. Estrada would have emphasized a lot on the awareness side of it, and I think that's important in the accessibility aspect, understanding the disability because as a company, you would decide on, okay, where are we going to start? So once you understand the disability you want to start with, then you can then decide on what is next. And most times, I think the important thing is having staff and key leaders sensitized at the beginning, and then everything spirals from there. Besides doing site and risk and safety assessments, because sometimes you do safety assessments and we are unaware of what we're actually looking for. So you also have to, when it comes to accessibility, engage persons with disability or persons who are in the field of disability to help you understand what exactly that you would be looking for as well. When it comes to the accessibility of it all.
All right, great. Thank you for sharing, Ms. La Fleur. Ms. Wong, you had unmuted a while ago. Still want to share? And Ms. Ash?
Yes, well, some of the employers mentioned some implementation measures that they can put in place, such as offering consultations, matching a flexible approach to address the staff challenges. So that depends on the type of disability, and providing special leaves or with job retention until the leave is over, holding return to work sessions, or arranging work conditions to meet the employee and the organization's need, and implementing work from home policies. Such measures were implemented by some of the organizations.
All right.
Conducting assessments as well.
All right, thank you for sharing, Ms. Ash. So those are some strategies. The next question is for Ms. Estrada and Ms. Ash. So does the ECA and the Ministry of Labor support the need for including employee assistance programs, so EAP, as a critical ingredient in a suite of policies and strategies?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
But we have to caution that it's not free. It's a benefit that the employer has to pay for. So it might be free for the employee, but generally it helps because, you know, people have to cope with a whole lot of different things, especially as a disabled person. It helps you to deal with this change that you now have to undergo, you know, and how do you, you know, fit in and different things that might come up, you know, that will assist. So we definitely we recommend.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ms. Estrada. Ms. Ash? How does the Ministry of Labor support the need for EAP as a critical ingredient in the suite of policies and strategies?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. All right, thank you very much for your response. So moving along with the question. So this question has to do with digital tools and technology. How can digital tools and technology help make workplaces more inclusive for persons with disabilities, and what challenges still need to be addressed in this regard? Any takers for the question?
Can
Mr.
you
Thomas?
repeat that question?
Yes, I can repeat. So can digital tools and technology help make workplaces more inclusive for persons with disabilities? That's one part of it. And the other part, are there any challenges that still needs to be addressed in that regard?
I would just basically say, as it relates to assistive technology, we need to invest in and provide access to assistive devices. So, for example, hearing aids, prosthetics, screen readers, and various mobility aids. So if it is that we try to support affordable access, so I know I'm not sure, and I could be correct, I stand to be corrected, that we take away the tax from those types of assistive devices, and then emerging with the entire AI-driven accessibility tools to make those things more feasible and more, I would say, more accessible to persons with disabilities is something that we could look into as well.
All right, great. Thank
And
you.
I would add
that
the challenges, the second part of the question remains that most person thinks tools, accessibility to tools or technological devices are costly. And sometimes it doesn't really cost much, or it doesn't cost a thing, because there are a lot of accessible devices and technological stuff online that sometimes when you scroll through or you try searching for things, you get some stuff that are free for persons to use probably on their cell phones, etc. So, and for the first part of the question, yes, it is. It's important actually, because we are already in a technological era where technology drives everything. So it's important to have technology to, you know, as assistive devices and to support. But the challenges continue that most people think it's quite expensive, and it's a challenge to actually implement it when sometimes it's not. Oh, and you also have somebody who is deaf. I think somebody saying Stephen Dukran, who is deaf, wants to ask a question, so he'd need his interpreters to assist with that.
Yes, that's not a problem, but we're not there in terms of that question yet. So just have a few questions first, and then we'll get to Mr. Dukran's question. So Mr. Dukran's question is coming up, right? Before we get there, is there an organization specifically to help persons with disabilities gain employment in Trinidad and Tobago? I'm not sure who wants to take that question. Kerwin, Mr. Thomas? Does that fall within the
remit of the TTDPI?
Yes.
Definitely, the Trinidad and Tobago chapter for persons with disabilities is definitely an advocate organization. So we will definitely reach out to persons in the job market, whether it be private or public, because persons will definitely send us their resumes, etc. We have persons with disabilities here in Trinidad and Tobago who have the degrees, masters, etc., doctorate degrees, who are skilled and competent. And as we was just making mention to the reasonable accommodation, how then do we bridge the gap? And I know that the Ministry of Labor is doing, they're putting a lot of emphasis in place for persons with disabilities to join the job market, whether it be in the OJT program or all the other programs. That I think that a lot more needs to be done, where we can be able to, as Miss Estrada mentioned before, and I think Ms. Wong would have mentioned in terms of the remote work. How then do we create a situation or a system where we can be able to hire more persons with disabilities to stay at their homes, sometimes at their little office space at home, where they do have to go to traverse through traveling and all the other accessibility barriers that create hindrances for persons with disabilities to be afforded job opportunities. So I think that the Trinidad and Tobago chapter for persons with disabilities and all the other organizations who advocate on behalf of persons with disabilities definitely need to take up this mantle where we can be able to get sustainable and meaningful employment for persons with disabilities. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Does anyone want to add? To just answer the question, there is no one organization that's specifically geared towards helping persons with disabilities gain employment in Trinidad and Tobago. But I think Mr. Thomas spoke to that question, but I'm just asking if any of the other panelists want to add to what Mr. Thomas said.
I know that, I'm not too sure, but Ms. Ash could correct me. I know that Ministry of Labor has been working along and working along with other organizations as well, so that they too can assist through the OJT program and other avenues to assist persons with disabilities in getting employment. So we have all the NGOs, they work along with organizations that are NGOs to assist them in their members being employed in different aspects. So I don't know if Ms. Ash could correct me if I'm wrong or not there.
Yes, the Ministry of Labor, through the Internal Committee on Promoting Inclusion for Persons with Disabilities, we work alongside different organizations to assist in the inclusion initiative for persons with disabilities.
All right, great. Thank you, Ms. La Fleur and Ms. Ash. One of the audience member is saying, though, that there should be such an organization, though, just to lobby specifically for the rights of differently able persons in employment. I don't know, what are the thoughts of the panelists? Do you agree or?
Because I'm in an NGO, and I don't know if Cohen would feel the same way, I don't think that would make much sense. The organizations are there for a purpose. And one of the purpose of the organizations that exist, be it disability-friendly organizations, is to do those things as well. So creating another organization to lobby on behalf of persons just for the purpose of employment, it doesn't really make much sense. It'll just be another organization that's going to be registered, and then we would have all kind of thing happening in there. I don't think it makes sense. I think what the Ministry of Labor does, we probably need to expand on that, where organizations work. There's a work along with the Ministry of Labor, and we could have an expansion on that project. If we could think of things like that, it may work best, but not the specific organization.
All right, great. Thank you for sharing, Ms. La Fleur. Mr. Thomas, I'm seeing you unmuted.
Definitely. I'd just like to add and piggyback on what Ms. La Fleur would have mentioned, to have one particular organization dealing with employment for persons with disabilities. I think that, as she mentioned before, that we have the Ministry of Labor, and I want to implore Ms. Tanisha, the representative from the Ministry of Labor, that the Trinidad and Tobago chapter for persons with disabilities is definitely open for discussions, as we can be able to really bring some of the persons who are seeking employment opportunities, and we can be able to bridge that gap and work together in tandem to execute such. All right, so thank you so much. As I said before, the representative, Ms. Tanisha from the Ministry of Labor, we definitely need to have some discussion as we be able to promote and get persons employed, or try to assist in getting persons employed.
All right, great. Does anyone else want to share specific to that question or add to the discussion that's happening?
I just wanted to add something in terms of on the national level. It's really, I mean, maybe unfortunately it is the law, where some persons who are in receipt of a grant or an allowance, it's removed if it is that they are employed. And I think it's patently unfair. Now, this view that I just expressed is the view of Ms. Estrada and not the ECA. So I think in terms of the collaboration and the efforts and the conversations, it's something that can also be addressed, in terms of the advocacy.
And just to add, besides the the subcommittee that is within the Ministry of Labour that is in charge of the Disability Inclusion Initiative. We also have a National Employment Services that for everyone, not just disabled, but also able-bodied. And through the National Employment Services, we can promote in the inclusion of persons with disabilities.
All right, great. Thank you very much. There's another question here. I'm trying to fully understand the question, so please bear with me. So the person is saying, I want to make reference to one of the ILO recommendation, building partnership with the disability community. So Ms. Wong, you would have spoken about the economic challenges in providing accommodations. And the question is, when organizations have the required accommodation, does the OJT interview persons with disabilities first to assess if they fit the position at that organization? So I'm not sure if there's a question for Ms. Wong or Ms. Ash or for anyone else on the panel. So does OJT, and this is specific to OJT, do they interview persons with disabilities first if the organization have the required accommodations? And this is speaking to HR processes. So who gets interviewed first if an organization is fit to hire a person with a disability?
I can answer from the point Mr. Bazio's question. I think I will answer from the Ministry of Labor's aspect. I know they govern the OJT, but generally at an interview, at a recruitment interview, it's inappropriate to ask the individual firstly what their disability is. It's not the most appropriate question to ask. However, if it is that an employer notes that they can clearly see a disability and it's visible, and they think that the person, the individual making the application for employment would have some sort of issues in terms of the application for the job, or while on the job, it may be plausible at that point to probably ask. Again, it's not the most appropriate thing, but for the Equal Opportunity Commission, one of the exemptions that we do have is for disability discrimination. One of the exemptions is that based on the nature of that person's disability and the environment in which they're expected to work. So let's just say they are blind, but they can't. It's not reasonably expected that they would apply for a position to be a pilot. So the nature of the work to be performed, therefore, is likely that it will pose a risk to others, and the person himself with a disability may injure others, and not only that, in all reasonable circumstances, may cause injury to themselves. I would say, is it that they fit the organization? One, what I could go further to say is that organizations should try to adopt a proactive approach to accessibility. If you ensure that your workplace is designed with universal accessibility or access, it can minimize that requirement for individualized accommodation. So you may not necessarily need to worry about this person's physical disability if your organization is already universally accessible, or you can offer accommodations proactively where it is possible. So if you know that OJT, for example, needs adjustable workstation or a flexible schedule, that is something that you can proffer as opposed to taking a reactive approach to it as well.
All right, great. Thank you, Ms. Lorelei. So I'm not seeing any questions coming through, but I just want to remind us why we're here today. We're speaking about the issue of workplace, the inclusion of persons with disabilities in the workplace, but we're here commemorating International Day of Persons with Disabilities. So I just want to throw out a question to the panelists, if that's all right, while other questions come in. And so Mr. Thomas would have spoken about this year's theme, amplifying the leadership of persons with disabilities for an inclusive and sustainable future. And so the question to the panelists, reflecting on this theme and the discussion today, what do you think needs to happen to amplify the leadership among the community of persons with disabilities in the context of inclusion in the workplace? So anyone can go first.
I think moving forward in terms of all the groundwork that has been done by the Ministry of Labour, which sets the tone in terms of the data, it can start not just a conversation, but at least lobbying for a national committee that could really get things going in tandem with the ILO, so that there's going to be a lot of improvement, at the end of the day, because we are heading in a particular direction. We are one of the people who have signed on to all of the conventions and the recommendations of the ILO. We consider ourselves to be a progressive society, and we want to replicate the things that are currently taking place, like Nestle's, Extra Foods, Scotiabank, one or two of the, the other employers, and, replicate that throughout the society, and also address the fact that we need to do things differently so that we have a different result at the end of the day.
All right, great. Thank you, Ms. Estrada. Ms. LaFleur?
Yeah, repeat the question just so I wouldn't go off course in
Yeah.
answering.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it's kind of a long question as well. So again, with the theme of International Day of Persons with Disabilities, and the theme again is amplifying the leadership of persons with disabilities for an inclusive and sustainable future. And so we're speaking specifically about the workplace. So it's amplifying the leadership of persons with disabilities for an inclusive workplace. Based on the discussion today, what do we need to amplify the leadership of persons with disabilities so that we create more inclusive workplaces?
I think when it comes to the leadership side of it, for me, I think persons with disabilities also, because there's a mindset adjustment that we need to have, not just on the side of persons without disabilities, but also persons with disabilities as well. For some persons with disabilities, they don't take that front step, and they're not very active in advocating for themselves. And I know a lot of qualified persons with disabilities, but they go in the background and hide because they're not going to hire me because I have a disability. I think advocacy, like self-advocacy, is key. And once you send out your resumes, and for me, don't be ashamed to say you have a disability. So send out those resumes and be bold enough to advocate for yourself, because you would identify their particular qualities in persons in that way. And once you identify that, when you get employed by an employer, they too will identify that in you. I would give one example. We have some young people working with us now, and one of the guys in particular, he's very shy, very hidden, but he's super intelligent. And from the first time he started working with some of the persons in the department that he's in, they all saw that in him. So it's something that they know he's an intelligent child. So we have to push him, and they put him in positions where he has to perform and show his ability to continuously perform. So I think in his part, he advocates for himself as well. This is not challenging enough for me. I want more. I want to do more. And they allow that to happen. So I think persons with disabilities themselves also have to be able to self-advocate and have the understanding of what their goals are. It's not just about getting a job and being employed, but it's about you having progression and growth and development in the employment process as well. Thanks.
All right, great. Thank you, Ms. LaFleur. Ms. Ash, I'm seeing you unmuted.
Yes, so adding to what Ms. LaFleur and Ms. Estrada said, I believe the sensitization sessions, as well as stakeholder engagement, content stakeholder engagements and sensitization sessions could assist in the inclusivity of persons with disabilities within the workplace. So that is part of the initiative by the Ministry of Labor.
All right, great. Ms. Wong or Mr. Thomas, anything to add in terms of amplifying the leadership of persons with disabilities, to create more inclusive workplaces?
I just say that they should ensure that leadership development programs are accessible. So you need to provide persons with the technology as well. And then you could offer mentorship programs, connecting those persons who have leaders with disabilities to established leaders already with or without disabilities. So you create that inclusive society and you're fostering that inclusive working culture as well. So again, just to emphasize on the DEI and the representation of persons with disabilities in leadership. So, and again, one important thing is to also celebrate those persons with disabilities in leadership roles, because the stigma associated to persons with disabilities already, once we show that we are fostering that belonging, we would ensure that justice and inclusivity does take place.
All right, great. Mr. Thomas, anything to add to the conversation? You did speak about it in your presentation, just wondering if you have anything else to add in terms of amplifying the leadership of persons with disabilities. Okay, so there are a few follow-up questions I'm seeing here, follow-up comments. And so just to say, the question with regards to the occupational therapist and the governance of the EOC, the person left a comment indicating that it is his or her suggestion to have a governance system, to have an occupational therapist as part of the governance system of the EOC, that it should be a requirement. So I'm not sure if Lorelei, if you want to add anything to what is being stated.
I did actually respond to, I think it's Mr. Rami, right? I did respond to him, but again, in terms of having that particular person, I think he was referring to where they have cases. So at the Equal Opportunity Tribunal, for example, you know, a case on disability may sometimes require expert witnesses. So I think that may point better off to that type of institution. But again, it can be something that we can propose as well.
All right, great. Thank you, Ms. Wong. So I'm just seeing a question. Are there leadership training and job streams particular for persons with disabilities? Is this something currently being considered or would be considered in the future? I'm not sure if Ms. Ash wants to take that question.
Can you repeat that question?
Yes, are there leadership training and job streams particular for persons with disabilities? Is this something currently being considered or would be considered in the future?
That is something that should be considered and we will take it into consideration.
All right, great. Thank you very much. And then Ministry of Labor, again, how does the Ministry of Labor help support people who become disabled to retrain or change professions as a result of a disability? Ms. Ash, so I'll repeat the question again. So how does the Ministry of Labor help support people who become disabled to retrain or change professions as a result of a disability? So Mr. Thomas, for example, would have spoken about having to change professions. I'm just wondering if the Ministry of Labor has any support systems in place to help persons do that.
That is something I will have to get back to. I have to consult with the ministry and get back to. I don't want
All right, great. Thank you. Yes, I understand. But thank you very much for taking those questions into consideration. So I'm seeing that we're almost close to the end of today's session. I'm just waiting to see if there are any other questions coming in. Yeah, so one question, and then I'm going to move into everyone providing short take-home messages, very short take-home messages, and then I'll pass over to Dr. Sukram for closing remarks. So the last question that we're taking, is it a right for a person to state they have a disability on their resume? Is it a right to state or to disclose a disability on a resume?
I'd say no. The only time you'd really disclose that you do have a disability is if you're seeking some form of reasonable accommodation. And it doesn't necessarily need to be on your resume per se, because again, you need to focus on a person's meritocracy. What are their qualifications? Are they suitable for that particular job? Is it that you can carry out the essential functions? The only time you bring up your disability voluntarily, and employers can encourage that open disclosure, that voluntary disclosure, by creating a safe place for persons to say that they do have this disability and these are the accommodations that they need. But again, it's not right for any employer to ask or to list out what your disability is on a resume.
All right, great. Anyone who wants to add to what Lorelei shared, Ms. Wong? All right, so I'm just going to ask each of the panelists to give, one message for us to take home based on our conversation today. It's not just a job, taking into consideration DEI and inclusion in the workplace for persons with disabilities. What would be your take-home message for us, including the audience members here today? So just about half a minute before I pass over to Dr. Sukram. Ms. Ash, I'm seeing you're muted, so feel free to share first. I don't think that was intentional, but yes, feel free to share what you take a message for our audience members here today.
Yeah, so Just to reiterate, the Ministry of Labor's goal for decent work, industrial peace, and opportunities for all, ensuring that no one is left behind. That includes persons with able-bodied as well as disabled-bodied persons. So we wish to continue the promotion of inclusivity in the workplace and to encourage employers to continue sensitizing staff on the inclusivity actions with persons with disability, for persons with disabilities. Thank you. That is it.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Ash. Ms. La Fleur?
Yeah, in closing, I'd say like to persons with disabilities themselves, as like the theme is for this year, that they too can be leaders. And I think mentorship is really a key thing as well. As somebody would have said in the chat, I think mentorship is something that we can have. So in closing, I want to say that be bold, be brave, and become your own advocate, because only you can advocate for you the right way. And for those of them who are, those persons who are out there who are qualified and know I could do this job, be bold enough to say that and do that and apply for any job you see posted and apply for them. And let's see what happens next.
All right, great. Thank you, Ms. La Fleur. Ms. Wong?
Right. Thank you, Dr. Parry. I'd just like to say in closing that from an equal opportunity standpoint, that we provide essential service for redress against disability discrimination in employment as well. And I'd just like to emphasize that reasonable accommodation ensures an inclusive and equitable workforce. And again, everyone has a role in fostering that culture of equality and accessibility.
All right, great. Thank you, Ms. Wong. Ms. Estrada?
I think some of the takeaways today would be some pluses in terms of all the gains that we have made thus far on a national level. And if it is that we can replicate some of those things in terms of having let's say a caravan, well, not necessarily given the Ministry of Labor work to do, but in terms of letting employers know, probably through a media program, you know, what are some of the things that are currently happening and what are some of the things that can be done, because really it may not cost anything, because at the end of the day, you know, we can have a slogan, let's all work together. And I think even something like that, you know, it really raises the level of awareness, because we tend to put people in categories. And sometimes the worst thing that can happen is those of us who are sighted, we are blind to some things. So I think really awareness is key, you know, education is key, and really having an open mind in terms of the possibilities. So let's not limit ourselves.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Estrada. And Mr. Thomas, the last word in terms of a key takeaway message?
And definitely, Dr. Perry. I think that as just to piggyback on what Ms. La Fleur mentioned, that persons with disabilities really need to believe in themselves, believe in an opportunity where they can be able to make the changes necessary for themselves. And also, as Mr. Estrada mentioned, in terms of the sensitization, we need to be able to sensitize the general public and also persons living with disabilities that there are opportunities that we could create through stakeholder participation, where we could be able to change the lives of persons with disabilities. And there will be nothing about us without us. So we definitely want to be included into the framework as we move things forward. Thank you so much, Dr. Perry and the team.
All right, great. Thank you, Mr. Thomas. So that brings us to the end of the presentations and the information shared by our panelists. Thank you very much for being a lovely audience and for participating the way that you did today. I'm going to pass over now to Dr. Sukram, Director of Services, for closing remarks.
Thanks very much, Papaya. So hello, everyone, again. As we draw today's panel discussion to a close, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to everyone who made this event possible. First, I want to express my appreciation to Dr. Lorelei Wong, the chair of today's panel, for her leadership and expertise. Her dedication to advancing disability inclusion through both research and practice has been invaluable, especially in guiding today's important discussion. We are grateful for her ongoing commitment to promoting equality and social justice for persons with disabilities. I'd also like to extend my sincere thanks to all our distinguished panelists. Your valuable insights and experiences have enhanced our understanding of how workplaces can better integrate persons with disability. And your contributions have been instrumental in shaping today's significant conversation about creating inclusive, accessible, and supportive work environments. A special thank you to Katia and Morris and the Solicitors staff for their dedication in organizing this event. Katie's behind-the-scenes work ensured everything ran smoothly, and I am deeply appreciative of her efforts. I'd also like to recognize the contributions of the marketing and communication team, especially Josanne, for their proactive efforts in promoting this important discussion and bringing together such a diverse and engaged audience. Josanne's commitment to ensuring the success of this event has been invaluable. Finally, to all of you who have joined us today, thank you for your participation. The commitment you have shown to advocating for a more inclusive and equitable future for persons with disability is admirable. As we move forward, let us take the knowledge shared today and continue to drive positive change in our communities and our workplaces. So have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. Thank you.